Assalamu alaikum and hi. So the topic for my presentation is on sentencing based on section 183 of the Criminal Procedure Code. So section 183 basically says that if the accused is convicted and sentenced, then the court shall pass sentence according to law. So let me just give you a brief example to illustrate this context. So currently we are facing with a pandemic due to COVID-19, and in Malaysia there is a movement control order or MCO enforced across the country. So, under the Prevention and Control of Infectious Diseases regulations, it is said that if I am caught breaching the MCO, then the court has power to fine me up to 1,000 ringgit or imprisonment up to 6 months. So let's say, for example, the court made an error in its sentence and the court fined me 5,000 ringgit. So clearly, that sentence is in contradiction of this section 183. So this is what the presentation is all about. So I'm going to illustrate according to this section 183 based on a case called Jamal bin Hussein and another against public prosecutor, which was decided in 2011. So in this case, the accused was charged with culpable homicide. So culpable homicide is basically an act which caused a person's death, but it does not amount to murder. Now, in this case, the accused has been convicted and was sentenced to 24 years imprisonment. So if you look at section 3 or 4 of the Penal Code, the it says with imprisonment for a term which may extend to 30 years. So you may be wondering, what is the issue here since the accused was sentenced up to 24 years? So that is not excessive in any way. So the issue is whether the sentence imposed was excessive. Now this is because when a judge give out sentence or sentences, he has discretionary powers, whether to look at the person's previous records, if any, and if the offender is a first-time offender. So, taking into account all these things, this is how the judge could come to a conclusion in giving out sentences. So, whether the sentence imposed was excessive is due maybe to the fact that the accused in this case were first-time offenders, but clearly this particular issue was not mentioned in the case. So this is my observation based on other cases that I read. Now the appellant's submission basically said that the sentence handed down by the court was excessive. So this is the prosecution's counter to that. The prosecution is saying the sentence imposed was adequate because it is well within the boundaries of the law. And another thing is, if you read that case, it is said that during that particular time, in 2011 and before that period of time, most offenders which were convicted of culpable homicide were sentenced to 30 years imprisonment, which is the maximum sentence that the court can afford to the offenders. So now in this case, when the court sentenced the accused to 24 years of imprisonment, there should be no problem with this sentence given by the court. So before I give you the judgment of the court straight away, I would just like to highlight a few cases in regards to sentencing. The first case is called Bandulananda, which was decided in 1982. Now, this case highlighted two main principles. The first one, it said, for appeal on sentencing, whether the sentence imposed was so far outside the normal discretionary limits. This is like what I said earlier. The court has many discretions or many discretionary powers to afford to the offenders to give out sentences whether to the maximum level or to minimum. Because maybe the act was done out of necessary, maybe the offender was a first-time offender, like that. And the second principle is the court will not interfere with sentences unless insufficient. Okay, so the next case that I'm going to highlight is the case of public prosecutor against Jafar bin Daud, which was decided in 1981. Now, in this case, there are three main principles that were highlighted. The first one is the judge must consider whether the accused is a first-time offender, like I said previously. The second one is where the convicted person has previous records. The judge must consider whether those previous records that the offender has or had before, whether the sentences imposed before had any deterrent on the offender. So if there is no deterrent effect on the offender, then the sentence must be imposed more severely than the sentences imposed before in the previous cases that the offender had. So this is basically the second principle. The third principle is, if he is found to be a persistent offender for a similar type of offences, it is in the interest of justice that a deterrent sentence should be passed. Okay. Now, before the judge passed down a judgment in this case, there were pertinent factors that the judge had considered, whether to lower the sentence or to put higher amount of sentence or amount of imprisonment of years to the offender. One of the factors considered was the cause of death is due to stab wound to the heart, and as it was viewed as concerted involvement of the assailants, it was obvious that the deceased was defenseless, and thus the commission of the offense was proved to be violent and vicious. Basically, the act of the assailants in this case were so vicious that that giving out sentences lower than what has been provided by the court would not show a deterrent effect on the offenders or anyone outside of this factor. Now, let's say if the offenders were given sentence not to the maximum level, what would they show to the public? So because the sentences given by the court should consider as well the interest of the public. So in this case, it was so bad, the act done by the assailants to the deceased was so bad that it was done in a violent and vicious, aggressive and inhumane manner. So it shows the atrocity of this case, that the sentence imposed must be at the maximum level and not to be lowered in any way, but to be at the maximum level to show that this act should not be repeated or should not be committed by any other person. So what does the judge say? It is clear that the appeal is dismissed because the court did not find any error to warrant its interference in the exercise of discretion in respect of the sentences imposed, and thus the appellant's appeal against the sentence was dismissed. So to conclude, Section 183 basically afford the court to give sentence according to law, within the boundaries of the law, and not to be excessive or not to be beyond from what has been given by the law. So there are many also other factors that the judge may take into consideration in giving out sentences. Whether the first one is whether the accused was a first-time offender, whether the act was done out of necessary, there are so many other things as well that the judge can consider. But in this case, it was so obvious that the deceased was defenseless, so there is no need for the act to be so viciously done to the deceased. So yes, to conclude, the judge has power to afford sentences or sentence to the accused within the boundaries of the law. So that is all from me. Thank you very much.